Life Management Science Labs would like to acknowledge that we live and produce this podcast on the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people. We'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands of our listeners and our international colleagues. We'd like to pay our respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. Hey everyone, and welcome to All Together, the Family Science Insights podcast, produced by Ellen Massell, the Life Management Science Labs. We are champions of life management science, providing structured insights informed by science and inspired by practice on key aspects of conscious living. Each week we bring you scientific and practical insights on each element, with the expert knowledge of professionals in the field. I'm your host, Dina Sargeant. Let's get started. Hey guys, and welcome back to another episode. Now, marriage definitely has its ups and downs, as we all know or have been told pretty much our entire childhood. Emotions can change for better or for worse, and that's exactly what we're going to be looking at today. We're joined today by Associate Professor of Human Development and Social Policy at Northwestern, Claudia Haase, Ph.D. Thank you so much for joining me, Claudia.
Yeah, it's good to be here. Thanks for having me.
Now, it's so interesting to talk about emotions as like going through a marriage and going through the spouse sort of relationship, because when we talk about emotions, you talk about interrelationships and you hear a lot of sort of emotions between siblings, between family members. But when it comes to spouses, you sort of see it as you're becoming one without thinking about the idea of two different people sort of coming together and two different ways of thinking, two different types of emotions, two different reactive personalities coming together and trying to figure out how they balance the two of each other.
Yeah, that's such a good observation. You know, when we start dating, typically that's a time when the highs are really high and the lows can be really low. So when we think of that stage, it's really, there's everything in there, you know, desire, uncertainty, maybe jealousy, fear, and and then when we travel into the years down the line, once we get married, I think there is this assumption that now there's a flattening and like almost kind of like a deadening in the emotional landscape that we travel through as a couple. And while that's certainly the case for some couples, our research actually shows that there is, first of all, a lot of emotions that are happening between couples because, you know, these are our closest relationships and they really confront us with our own deepest insecurities, needs, wishes. Sometimes we're on the same page and sometimes we are not. And so they're full of emotions. And as we get older, we actually become sweeter with each other and we can become less hostile and less bitter. So there's a lot of change towards the better when we look at emotional changes within a marriage.
Mm-hmm. And so how did you go from human development into sort of the marital aspect into it? Because it must have been something that really sort of got you interested in wanting to talk about the spousal relationships.
That's such a good question. So when we think of development, there are obviously so many things we can talk about. And we often think of babies and children and maybe teenagers. And then we think, oh, that's all there is, you know, like we're done, we're grown up now. But the reality is that we continue to evolve and change throughout our entire lives until very late in life. And I actually think that emotions are these little micro ingredients of change. Like the word emotion itself, it comes from emover, which means moving out. And when we are in the throes of an emotion, there's a lot of that changes in our bodies, on our faces, in our voices, in our conscious experience. And I do think through these little small moments, emotional moments, we actually build bigger changes towards better, or also for some people towards the worse as we get older. And so started to get really interested in emotions as these building blocks of human development. And then where do emotions happen a lot? Well, they are deeply interpersonal. And you said, you know, we have a lot of emotions that may come up with friends or with siblings, with our parents, with our children. But I actually do think this realm of romantic, intimate, and married relationships is just a context where emotions, you can kind of like see everything. And that kind of like led me from this big interest and how do people change and, grow into who they are meant to be and want to be, to studying emotions in this context.
No, it's very true. And I think it definitely has a huge conversation that we're sort of lacking in the gaps that we're talking about when it comes to marriage and relationships. Like there's that whole idea of where we're going to be together. But I think also there's that idea of divorce. The divorce rates are pretty high in this day and age. People calling it quits over, I mean, there's some reasons for divorce, yes. But I think there are some other reasons where it's like, well, can't you just talk about it? Isn't there a way that you can sort of figure things out without that being the first thing that sort of comes to mind, and that being, okay, I want out, being away. I mean, I've heard so many. I mean, even celebrities, when you hear about the reason that they're getting divorced, it's an insane reason to get divorced. Just things aren't working out, or things aren't. There's no conversation. There's no love. Well, can't they be that kind of conversation that sort of says, "This is what my expectations are, and this is what I feel I'm not getting," kind of idea as well. So it's a huge thing when we're talking about long-term relationships and long-term marriages, because you don't hear that working out so much in this day and age.
Yeah, it's so funny as you were talking about the celebrity couples, I thought of some of them that, I give Angelina Jolie and Brad Pitt as an example of a celebrity couple who supposedly has it all, like they are rich, they are famous, they're super successful in their careers, they're supposed to be beautiful. And these are all ingredients that people think of, and they think of what makes a marriage successful, right? But it turns out in this case, it's not an exception either. Like all of these things appear to be relatively unimportant, and that led the kind of like research tradition that I work in to become really curious about these emotional underpinnings, to say, money does matter and our jobs do matter, but they're not everything. And there's actually so much that's going on that has so little to do with what we have financially or economically. And that has a lot to do with, I would almost call it like our emotional wealth or emotional poverty. And and leave it at that.
Yeah, no, that's perfect. And that's such a great introduction to what we're talking about today. Before we get deeper into it, I'd love to get to know some of your interests and maybe some recommendations that you can share with us. So to start off with, do you have a favorite book that you could share with us?
So I do have a book that I really enjoy. I'm gonna kind of like show it. It's called Rest is Resistance by Tricia Fursi. And she talks about that rest is not just nice to have, but it's actually a necessity. And she grounds this in a liberalist or in a liberationist, feminist, Black theology. But I do think a lot of the lessons and a lot of the wisdom she shares, I found a lot of that also so super valuable for me. I think people often struggle with feeling like you have to always produce and be something and do something and earn our rest and earn our sleep and earn the right to relax. And I think she's telling us here, we can just be and be free and have a right to rest. And she is the founder of, she calls it the Nap Ministry. And she is just an amazing person and writes like a poet. And she is a poet. So that's a great book that I want to recommend. And I really enjoyed reading.
No, that sounds like such a great book. And I think it's so right in its message as well. The fact that we feel like we're not productive if we're just sitting down and watching TV, or if we're sitting down and not doing anything. Like, okay, we can sit down and watch TV, but also, I can fold laundry as I'm watching TV, or I can do other stuff. So I'm still getting things done. But at the same time, rest is still a huge part of what we're needing. So no, I love the message of that book.
It's so funny. I'm thinking about the people who are listening to this podcast right now who might be doing all of the things that you're describing. Maybe they are on their fitness bike or folding laundry. And if you're listening to this, just use it as encouragement. Like, you can continue doing all of those things, but you can also just put them to the side and just rest and relax a little bit. It's really okay.
Yes. No, it is okay to say that I'm just going to sit on the couch for the day and just lie down in bed and just read a book or just sit there for if you want to. So it's totally fine. So, how about a movie that you've recently watched?
So I have two small children, and so most of the movies I watch these days are movies that my kids want to watch, and they are not necessarily my favorite movies. But recently, we actually all went to a movie that's called We Grow Now. And that's a movie about a housing complex in Chicago. And it tells the story of two boys who grow up in this insanely large, labyrinthic housing complex, two Black boys, and follows them and tells a story of their friendship and everything else in a way that I found just so moving. And it doesn't really have a happy end. And I think that made it much, even more precious to me. So that's a movie I really enjoyed and recommend. And there are other movies that, given my interest in human development, I just really love movies that tell stories of how people grow up and change and develop.
Mm-hmm. No, you're definitely in the right field for that then, if that's the genre that you really like. No, I love movies like that as well. I feel like it needs to have that kind of story in order for me to keep interested in wanting to know more about it as to what they decide to do with the situation that they're put in, or what they decide to react on, how they decide to think about situations. So no, that movie is definitely something that I'm going to have to look up after we've finished today. Now, how about a most recent podcast that you've listened to?
Well, obviously, I really, I'm super curious about this podcast, and I think
hype myself up a bit.
Yes. I think you're an amazing podcast host and interviewer. And another podcast that I really like is Esther Perel's podcast. And she is a couples therapist and conducts these one-session interventions with couples, or sometimes only just one person. And this is an extraordinary woman and therapist. The stories that we hear in these podcast episodes, they are sometimes really dicey. They're very raw. And she is just fantastic in terms of her insights, the way she navigates these conversations, the self-awareness she has also about maybe I should have said something else instead here. Sometimes she comments, about what she said in the moment. So that's just an amazing podcast that I really enjoy listening to.
Mm-hmm. No, well, I think I've heard her a couple of times being recommended to me on the show because there's so many other developments that sort of come on. And I love the way that a lot of people talk about her in terms of how she's interviewing them, where it's giving them the space to talk and also not forcing them to say things that they don't want to talk about. Like the amount of research that she does do with each guest is incredible to sort of see.
Yes, and she's funny and deep at the same time. So she manages both the lightness and the depth. And she's wonderful.
Yeah, no, she does sound amazing. I definitely have to give her more of a listen more often because I love the way that she does sort of get described by a lot of the other guests that come onto the show.
That's so funny. She makes an appearance regularly.
She does come up quite a bit now. So I know that everybody has a very different idea as to what family is and their whole idea of what creates a family and what makes a family. To your professional or even personal opinion, do you have a definition for what a family is and what a family does look like?
Wow, you really starting with the hard questions, right?
Well, I went straight from the easy questions to dove down into it.
I have a couple of associations. So first of all, I think of our family of origin, just kind of like one family nexus that we're thinking about, and how these relationships, in a way, often set the stage for how we ourselves navigate our own family lives later on. And then also the cycle breakers who are able to actually do and create something very, very different with their lives and have a very different idea of the family that they want to build. And I'm also thinking of, chosen family, which can be friends or even a community, which transcends these, traditional like wife, husband, and two children model that people often have when they think of a family. I think we've seen a lot more fluidity and openness and experimenting with different models. And what I really like about kind of like thinking about what a family means is this idea of choice, that you are actually not able to choose the family you're born into, but you are able to choose the family that you want to build if that's something that you're interested in.
Mm-hmm. No, I do love the changes. And I think I love the idea of how it's sort of changed as the times have sort of grown. Like the whole idea of you don't have to be close to a biological family. You don't have to sort of be surrounded, but you can sort of have that idea of you are able to choose who you want to be part of your family. And it's part of the emotional family that you want yourself to be a part of as well. Like you want examples of what it means to truly love someone or care about someone. And you're not always born into a family where that is available or that is an example of what love is supposed to look like. And I also love the idea of the separation between the two. Like there's a responsibility with your born family, with your biological family, to sort of have that relationship with them. But there's also, when it comes to chosen family or the family that you create, you have that availability to choose how you want to present yourself to them and how you want to be with them. And you have that cycle breaker relationship with the chosen family of, okay, I don't want to be so dismissive or so uninterested in what they're up to like I am with my born family.
Yes. And I think, when I teach, I often get these questions from students about how do I break cycles and how do I become someone who is not like my dad or my mom, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's probably a question that is really important when you're just at the cusp of becoming a young adult. But in a way, I actually think it continues to be relevant throughout the seasons of life, and the way we look at our family of origin might also change, maybe
Mm-hmm.
after a period of wanting and needing more separation, we also come then to a different transformed understanding, of what they were up to. And I do think the navigating this complex web of different families that we are part of. Sometimes people also refer to their work environments or their teams as a family, and I have my own thoughts on that too. I think the beauty of it is that as we go older, I think we can really become much more intentional about how we navigate all of these different relationships and what we are into at a given moment and where we want to step away from at a given moment. And it's in flux and can continue to evolve.
Mm-hmm. No, that's very true. And when it comes to marital relationships as well, like that's a huge other sort of family that you're creating or family that you want to build. How does that tie in with the emotional regulation? Also, like the idea of two separate people sort of coming together pretty much under a contract of saying, I'm going to hold this end of my bargain while you hold this end of your bargain, and we somehow try to come to a conclusion. How does that fit in with the emotions that family sort of comes in with that?
Yeah. So I think one interesting question is what we mean or what we talk about anyway when we talk about emotions. Like, what is an emotion, right? And oftentimes the easiest way to talk about emotions is just to ask someone, like, so what are you feeling right now? And then people tell you, oh, I'm a little worried, or, just a little annoyed, or, okay. But when when as scientists look at emotions, this is just the tip of the iceberg for us. So there are a lot of other emotional layers that we're also interested in. So we're also really interested in all sorts of emotional behaviors, and that can be facial expressions, but also body language that sometimes give away things that we might not even be consciously aware of ourselves. The voice is also not just the language, which is another important emotional layer, just even the words we use, but the voice itself, does it sound like super strained or is it relaxed? And then, of course, our whole entire bodies, where our hearts beat faster when we are in the throes of some emotions, and our skin starts to get really hot, perhaps, when we are angry, and maybe we feel kind of like this sense of warmth in our chest that goes along with feeling just deeply loved and affectionate. And all of these physiological changes are just another layer of emotions as well. And in this way, there is a lot that we are not necessarily aware of, but that nevertheless plays a role in, what we express, even unintentionally, to our partners, and what they pick up on. And when people look at marriages, they often kind of like start with this conscious layer and try to kind of like just talk, and that remains the level. And I'm not saying that's not important. I would say it's important, and there is just so much more that's going on that deserves attention, that becomes really, really powerful if not attended to and listened to.
No, that's very true. Now, parts of our conversation today is based on a study that you took part in, which followed the emotions of middle-aged and older couples over a 13-year period. Can you tell us a little bit more about why that study was important in sort of understanding emotions within a marriage?
Yes, this is really just such an extraordinary study, and it was not started by me. When the study began, I was still living in East Germany behind the Iron Curtain, and the people who started the study were Bob Levinson, John Gottman, and Laura Carstensen. And they have this, kind of like sample of couples from the Bay Area. And the paper that you're referring to looks at the first 13 years in this study, and it's already a really long time. But now we actually have data on these couples 30 years later. And some of these couples in the original study are no longer alive. And what makes this so fascinating is that now, so we can look at a number of different things, like how did their marital satisfaction change over time? What was really good and what made for a happy marriage and what was a recipe for misery? But we can, beyond marital satisfaction, also look at other things like health and even how long these partners live. And that's some of the latest work that we've been doing. The 13-year period and the study that you're talking about, that's really asking this question over a decade plus. Can be kind of like make a forecast, almost like looking into a crystal ball of what's going to happen with your relationship satisfaction based on a little, kind of like snippet in the life of a couple. They come into the lab, and after going through a series or, of different conversations, they do have a conversation about an area of disagreement in their relationship. And the way we set this up is people would ask them, try to think of the, let's say, top 3 arguments that you have with your spouse. And you can think, to yourself, like, what are the 3 things we always argue about? And oftentimes we ask people separately, but then it turns out there's considerable overlap. And so it turns out maybe, like you have a really big disagreement, let's say about in-laws. And then the instruction is to just talk about this area of disagreement and try to come to some sort of resolution for 15 minutes. And we asked them at the end of the period to rate their emotions to get at this layer of subjective experience. But we also videotaped them, and we also monitor physiological signals, how fast their heart beats and their blood pressure, whether it spikes or remains relatively calm. And out of these different channels of emotional information that we get from these couples, it turns out that there's a lot here that can tell us something not just about how the couple is doing in that moment, but how the couple might be doing 13 years later.
Oh, wow. No, it's a really interesting study to sort of read into and look into, because one of the results that I found, one of the results that was written up, was the idea of the financial stress, the marital stress sort of decreases as that 13 years sort of takes place. And there's less focus on the negative emotions and a lot more focus on the positive relationship that sort of comes between. And it's a really interesting idea of the fact that we're so worried, especially as young couples, we're sort of really worried about that financial stress and building a life together and figuring out how both of the careers are going to overlap, both of the finances are going to overlap. But when you're looking at that far ahead, for the idea of a long-term marriage being 15 years and also 40 years in the making, there's so much less stress that sort of comes in with them, because the idea of the communication, because the idea of the both of them sitting down and actually talking with one another. And when I'm looking at it, the idea of sitting down and talking with your partner is so lost on young couples, is so lost on couples within like 5 years in the making, because we're just not able to regulate our own emotions to build up that conversation.
And why do you think that is? Do you think that's kind of like a recent phenomenon, or something that's just more generally the case when you're starting out as a couple?
I think we're so used to picking arguments, to sort of picking at different aspects, and we're not used to sort of talking things through as they're developing. We're waiting until that moment where we can actually blow up, because we're thinking in our heads, oh, I'm going to bring that up the next time I argue. And also because the divorce rates of a lot of the parents of the couples sort of is higher. Like my parents are divorced, my parents have split up, and so I'm not used to that idea of divorce is something that's in my mind. When it comes to my partner, his family are very well situated, his family are they communicate really well. So I'm not used to the amount of communication that he's giving me, but that's something that I'm having to work on, and I'm always just like having to figure out how to communicate, because that's not something that I've been taught. It's not something that's been an example for me. So reevaluating the situation as it's coming and actually talking through with him as the situation has developed is something that's so foreign to me that I've had to learn in this relationship.
But it sounds like something, that is probably the experience of many younger couples and younger people. And we get, in school lessons in so many different subjects, but I don't think we really get a good education in how to relate to each other and how to be vulnerable and how to kind of like have these difficult conversations in a way that make us not blow up, but where we can be truthful and meet each other in a moment of, humanity almost, right? And what we find, and this is not just something that came out of this couple study, but that shows up in various different studies, actually in many different countries around the world. As people get older, yes, perhaps there is less external stress, but they also, on average, seem to be more capable at not sweating the small stuff, so to speak. And some of this is a theory that explains the shift. It's a socio-emotional selectivity theory. Some of this may come because as we get older, we become more aware, our life on this earth is not gonna be unlimited. And we better make the most of the here and now, we focus on what's good, what's valuable, what makes us happy and fulfilled, gives us joy. And all of these things, they happen with people we are close to, people we have close, meaningful relationships to. So this is really becomes a really important context in which we can live this, appreciation of how precious life is. And I think it's easy to lose sight of that too when you're younger and just trying to kind of like establish yourself and make it in the world and explore and have a million of different experiences. I think that's very important too. But with that comes, I think, just so much uncertainty and also potential for just a lot of disappointment. And I think as we look at emotional aging, this starts to shift when couples or even individuals grow older.
And it's also the idea of, I don't want to relive that experience again. Like for me, seeing my parents divorce, seeing my parents split up, that's the only example I have of a marriage that ends up in a divorce, that it ends up in things not working out. So I'm always just like, or even before him, that idea of, okay, I don't want to be like that. So that means a way to protect myself was to not be in a relationship at all, was to not sort of go for something that I could actually be happy in. And so rewiring my brain and rewiring the past experiences and the trauma of that is such a difficult thing for me to figure out, especially coming up to my late 20s. And that idea of, okay, everyone's saying settle down, get married, have kids, build that part of your life up. But for me, I'm just pretty much trying to recover from my parents splitting up, from my parents sort of going through that situation. Now, this might be just a personal question for me, but how would I sort of go about regulating my own emotions in that situation and trying to not let it peek into the relationship?
Yeah, that's such a good question. I wonder if that is actually necessary or even feasible, I think you're kind of like almost trying, it sounds like you're trying to keep it out, to not have the current relationship tainted by the demons of the past. And as understandable as that is, I think like one different way of looking at it would be to say, that's also part of me and that informs some of these fears. So they're not unfounded in a way, they come from a place. And at the same time, perhaps making space for a different future. And I do think that actually comes up in so many other domains in life too. We look at the generation of our parents or even grandparents, and in a way we know we have to find a different way of life. We have to make some changes. And I think that can be really daunting, but I do think there's also a lot of freedom in there. And I, by the way, don't think you have to follow the script of, I have to get married and then kids and the house and all of that and the dog. I think you can maybe as an exercise, really try to picture yourself in the life or the different lives that you would really enjoy and really visualize it and kind of like picture it in your mind. And I also think that could be a great conversation to start with a partner and say, we're not planning our future. This is just really playing around, like where would we like to live and why there, and I think as you are going through these different images, you start to figure out, I think, a lot about not just the future, but also the relationship, and maybe also find a way to integrate that story that your parents have lived and that you've lived with them into the story of you right now.
No, that's a good answer. It's a great concept, I think, just to sit there and just imagine the different ways, sort of what Sylvia Plath is in The Bell Jar, how she gets the fig tree and sees this different lives that she can live. And I'm always going back to that book. As depressing as that book is, it's such a great way into telling what the different areas, like how people relate to that as well. Like the way that people are relating, they're not thinking sitting down and working a 9 to 5 job as being their big aspiration. They're thinking of traveling, or they're thinking of doing all these things that don't, or being a poet or being a writer as their life ambition. And it's amazing to see how society has made us think that our whole idea, our whole job in this world is to find someone, get married, do an office job, have kids, let the kids focus on that 401k idea, focus on the surviving, not living it. And I think socially, especially the younger couples, and I think this generation now has definitely rewired their idea of, oh, I'm just going to be young and going to live for now. I'm not going to worry about the future so much. And I think for my age group, with the 25 to 30, we're in between both of them, where we're like, we're thinking about planning the future, but we still want to enjoy the time that we have. We still want to enjoy and live in the present. So when it comes to marriages, especially couples who are married young, we're sort of like, okay, we're married, so we are building a future, but we're also still trying to enjoy the fact that we are in our first 2 years of marriage, or we are still enjoying the first few years of our lives together and finding that house and maybe building that life, but also building the relationship as well.
Yeah, and I'm also thinking of COVID as just this, like just huge, big event that we've all been through in so many different ways in which that has shaped relationships and how we think about the moment. I actually tend to think that you can both like be very present in the moment and also have these dreams about a future. And I do think these dreams, they are important because I think, we provide meaning, and not in the sense of a checklist, like the boxes that I have to tick, but really to getting to what Dina or Claudia, like whoever is listening, what you really want and what you as a couple want. And that there is kind of like, I think, a way in which this future dreaming can be happening at the same time as playing and enjoying the present too. Don't think you have to choose.
So there are couples that you looked at who are in sort of the older couple area bracket. Was there a conversation as to how their younger, sort of early years in their marriage and how they sort of developed that as well?
Yes, I think these conversations, I just find them endlessly fascinating. It's such a privilege in a way to study like people and to kind of like get to kind of like be privy to these very intimate conversations. And yes, like some of the couples, they even chart kind of like their emotional journey, and they tell sometimes harrowing stories of one spouse, having cancer and how hard that was, but also, and that's a really interesting story in this particular couple, how they came out of this experience actually finding a way to connect with each other. So in this case, this joint experience didn't break this couple apart, but actually brought them closer. And it's super fascinating to watch them reflect on these journeys and also talk about how I was then, back then like this, and we are like that now. These conversations, I think, are probably some of my favorite ones. Looking into the past and charting this course of what happened to us. How did we land here?
Yeah, no, it sounds like an amazing study, and I definitely have to go and read into it a whole lot more, because there's that whole idea of the amount of pressure that they probably felt going through it, being a young couple, and then how they are now and how they're a little bit more relaxed, they're a little bit more set in their ways, but they're both happier together. And you don't hear a lot of long-term marriages being 60 years in or 45 years in. So having those as examples are such great ways of seeing that there is a light at the end of the first 3 years of marriage, because you are still trying to figure out who you are as a couple, but also as individuals who are set to be with someone for the rest of your life?
Yeah, that's such a great point. I think the first couple of years in the life of a marriage, they are actually really the hardest. And in that study, very deliberately, John Gottman, Bob Levinson, and Laura Christensen, they included couples who were already in long-term marriages. Because they wanted to be really studying what happens to these couples as they got older. And these initial years, for some couples, they are full of, bliss and harmony. But I think for more couples, this is a really tumultuous time. And once you've kind of like made it past a certain threshold, I don't want to give a number of years, but at some point you really enter different waters, and not that everything is rosy and amazing and there's no conflict anymore. Absolutely not. But there are some shifts that happen, and typically it's defined for the better.
Mm-hmm. That's amazing. Now, this leads us really well into the next part of the show, which is the practice and habits. Now, what is your recommended practice for couples to enhance their emotional intelligence and maybe their communication skills amongst each other?
So I do want to plug a couple of books actually by John Gottman, who is one of the authors, or like the researchers who started this study, who now runs this very famous Gottman Institute. And there are a couple of books that he has that are full of amazing ideas. And one of these books is called 8 Dates. And it charts like 8 different ideas for a date that you can go on with your partner. And you don't have to be married, by the way. And sometimes I think you don't even have to be in a romantic relationship. This also works with a friend. And what's really cool about this work is that it's grounded in science. It's kind of like really taking up some of the things that we know are important and makes them kind of like into a book that, like you and I can read. And one of the many ideas that I like in there is to nourish a sense of adventure and go and do something really new. And I think it's really important to emphasize this won't work if you pressure yourself and you're like, oh, now out of all of the things I have to do at the end of my to-do list, there is this other thing I have to check off. It's like, go out and do something new. It's not like that. As an opportunity to actually go out and explore and do something that you're both excited about, that you're both new to. And the underlying neurobiology is tapping into a system, the dopaminergic system, that gets activated whenever we encounter something new. That's kind of like a neurotransmitter that our body produces when encountered with novelty. And this is just one aspect of also then discovering new aspects of who you are and who you are together, actually seeing your partner and, in a totally new situation. You're like, wow, I had no idea you're in this white water rafting situation and we are almost, kind of like falling over, and you both are like in a moment that is so outside of the realm of what you normally do. And you come back with that experience. And then I think that stays with you. I have to kind of for instance, remember when my husband and I, we went on a vacation, and on our very last day, we went snorkeling, and we didn't have enough time to even take a shower because we were just enjoying the snorkeling so much. So we went straight into the plane, unshowered, and the poor person sitting next to us was just like, oh my God, can you please stop talking? And then we had just the funnest thing. I never read these in-flight magazines, but we started reading the magazines, and they were so funny. They kind of sold a little staircase for a dog. We both thought this was the funniest thing we had seen in a long time. And so we were sitting there giggling, and that memory, sometimes even now, when I think, especially sometimes when times are rough, we think back to those moments and they become just huge treasures and like wells of just joy and adventure. So that would be one out of many, many recommendations and things that you could do as a couple. Go on an adventure together.
I think it's great as well because it has that neutral playing field where it's like you don't, like especially snorkeling as well. If both of you don't snorkel often, then it's like you're experiencing it for the first time together or you're figuring things out together, which is so great. Like one of the things that my partner and I really figured out as well when it comes to the things that we like to do together is just like yesterday we went to this open space where the construction was still happening, and we just started we picked a place that we're going to throw a rock at, and we each had to aim just to throw the rock there.
That's so cool.
And it was so random. We were just wasting time waiting for his family to get to be ready so we could go out. And we just started throwing a rock at different places and aiming for it. And I don't think we've had that much fun individually, even separately. So coming together and both of us doing that, making a game out of nothing, I think is the best, most important thing that you can still do with a partner, and sort of building on that idea of you don't have to spend so much money. You don't have to spend anything if you're really supposed to be together. There's that idea you can make a fun game out of anything.
Yeah, I love your example so much more than mine. Mine is really, like, oh, you need to go snorkeling and not on the airplane. And that was really nice. But you're totally right. You don't need all of these things. And I just love what you're describing. And you said, oh, we were just wasting time. But I actually think this time that you had there is so not wasted at all, right? It is so, I love it. And I actually think that we generally make so little time for like play and silliness in our lives. Everything has to have a purpose and be optimized and And I think we miss out on these like so precious moments. And I love the story that you're telling about the little rock.
Yeah, I think it comes on. I think that idea of because we don't see each other that often. We only have the weekends because weekdays are pretty much the busiest time for both of us. So sitting the weekend, we're always planning to do something. But the moments that we don't plan on anything, we just end up going into his car and just driving, going hiking or doing something. And it's so nice just to have that away time where you're not having to really do a lot. You're not really having to think as well. I think it's a good thing when you're together and you don't have to think about anything. Like your brain is completely empty.
Yes, I love it. Do you listen to music in the car when you're driving?
No, we try not to because we listen to it individually. So when we're together, we try not just to spend that complete time together, and we just end up talking about anything. I don't remember like the things that we talk about, but it's just so mind numbing that we don't even pay attention to it half the time. So yeah, no, I really like that idea of just having that time together. And I think that's important as well. I mean, we're still very much in the early stages of the relationship, but it's still the honeymoon phase, as everyone likes to call it. But I still love the phase, and I love that we can still plan ahead, but also have that time together when we're together.
Yeah. And speaking of driving in a car, I think there is something when you're sitting next to each other and not facing each other that can really facilitate deep conversations. I think sometimes it's actually easier to say something vulnerable if you're not directly kind of like sitting opposite of each other, kind of like both looking in the same direction. So even just the seating arrangement and then the sense of moving, I think, in a car can also just really also introduce this element of adventurousness. And I'm thinking of all of the people who are listening to this podcast and they're like, what the heck are they talking about? Like I have a mortgage and like your kids to feed and like I have barely time, to kind of like shower in the morning. And I want to be really, really mindful of the very real constraints that many, many, many people are under. And even more important, I think, is it then for people who do have a little bit more freedom in their own life to work towards not just creating these moments for themselves, but ideally also helping other people be more liberated and more free and kind of like having opportunities for playfulness and joy and fun and adventure.
Yeah, even the little tiny things. Like I remember his family are really good at sort of making breakfast in the morning together, or especially on the weekends where they'll go make breakfast. Like his mom and dad end up going and making pancakes in the morning together. And it's nice to sort of see them and see that example and be like, oh, that will be us in like 10 years, 20 years, sort of having that idea. So no, I love it too. And I love the emotion regulation between the two of them, which is such a great example for me to see and for me to sort of change that idea of what marriage can look like.
Yes, oh, that's wonderful.
Yeah.
You are so lucky. And those pancakes, yes, they can be, they're so, I think kind of like what I think we're both kind of like just struggling around is the sense of like small moments. They can and do really make a huge difference. And that doesn't mean that every little moment has to be an amazing highlight. It's exactly just those, like the pancakes or the rock throwing or, the drive in the car where you can transform the ordinary into magic. And I do think that's possible.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think it's easier said than done for sure. I think for a lot of couples, life stresses out, life sort of has a toll on you, but there is those small moments where it can really make a difference and a lot of times. So yeah. This ties us really well into the last section of the show, which is the open mic. Now, this gives you a chance to talk about something that we maybe didn't get to talk about today throughout the show, or maybe a recent study that you're wanting to talk about that we haven't really heard from yet. So, no, in the last couple of minutes, I'd love to give you the floor and share what's on your mind with us today.
Oh, wonderful. I'm almost a little sad that it's almost over. So I'm like, oh, this is the end of the show. Okay. There's so many things I could talk about, but I share one with you. There is often this idea that emotions and the way we have talked about them, they happen in one person and then in the other person. And they kind of like are exchanging those emotional moments, but there's not really a sense of what happens when we simultaneously at the same time synchronize with someone else. And there's this whole relatively newish area of research on interpersonal synchrony, where it turns out people synchronize their heart rates, their brains, their smiles, and these synchronization processes, they do happen in the couples in this study too. And you can synchronize in moments of anger, and that's also super interesting to look at. But in the study that I want to plug here, which was led by Jenna Wells, who's just an amazing researcher at Cornell University and co-authored by Bob Levinson and Barbara Fredrickson, who's all like just amazing, wonderful researchers. In the study, we focused on these moments of positivity resonance, the idea that both partners at the same time share moments of positive emotions. They simultaneously smile, their bodies, their heart rates sync up physiologically as they're going through positive emotions. They both say, when we ask them, like this was a moment where I felt really good, and they both say that. And it turns out couples who have more of these moments of positivity resonance, or you could also maybe call them like micro kindnesses, like shared positive emotions. The couples in which that happened, those were the couples who not only had better health, long-term health outcomes, but at the end of this like now 30 study period, these are also the people who are a little more likely to survive a little bit longer. So there is kind of like controlling and accounting for all sorts of other factors, including how much positive emotions each partner individually experiences. So above and beyond all of that, the amount of shared positive emotion turned out to be a really important ingredient predicting longer lives in this particular sample. And now the question obviously is, does this also hold for other couples in other areas of the world, in other, kind of like generations? What are the underlying mechanisms? Why does this happen? So this is just the beginning of a long journey of figuring all of that out. But what I find so interesting is that it just emphasizes this interconnectedness at the level of sharing moments of positivity down to the biological level where these things are not even conscious, and making clear that, those moments can have real consequences for, hard, objective health and even longevity outcomes.
Mm-hmm. That's going to be such an interesting study. And it's amazing at the fact that this study hasn't been done before, or at least to this scope that it hasn't been done, especially in the amount of years that we have talked about emotional connections and we have talked about relationships. But this area, there's still a gap in the research for what we're looking at, because relationships are a huge part of development, a huge part of like the social aspect. But no, that's going to be a really interesting study to sort of have a view on and have a look at. And I definitely would love to see how that progresses as well and see its development sort of take part. So no, thank you so much, Claudia, for sharing that with us and also for joining me on the show today. I absolutely loved having this conversation and talking about the study of relationships and the study of marriages in long-term relationships. And I think its effect that it has on individuals' emotions as well. And sort of seeing like, oh, it does get easier as you get older. It sort of does sort of figure itself out as well if you're willing to put in the work to do that.
Yes, I think that's beautifully said. And you're right. Like you would think, oh, why aren't there so many more studies on this? And I sometimes have the same feeling. We know that relationships matter for, health and well-being and longevity and all of these things. But what we know so little about is what actually makes for a good relationship, It's kind of like easy to say, yes, when things are good things will happen. But how do you get to that spot? How do you make that happen? And the cool thing about this research is that there is, a lot of mystery to emotions and relationships, but there's also science that can be done here. And we can figure some of these mysteries out and learn from the couples in our study and in many other studies.
Exactly. Well, thank you so much, Claudia, for coming on. I absolutely love talking about this. And I always love talking about human development as well, especially in the aspect of relationships, because I feel like it's something that we don't talk about in everyday conversations as much as we should do. So, no, thank you for joining me on the show. It was amazing having you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And as the recording kind of like is, broken off, I will say that another guest, in case you're looking for people to come on, that I think you would have so much fun to talk to, would be a former Ph.D. student of mine, Emily Hittner, and she works as a director of research for Hinge, which is a dating app. Yeah. And I do think that questions of, like dating and dating apps and all of this stage in the life of a couple that we didn't get to talk about as much, like she's an expert on this and she's super fun to talk to and just, so funny and smart and amazing and has the insight into what does this actually look like as you are thinking about how to design a dating app.
Yeah, no, especially in the early stages of relationship as well, when you first meet a couple, when you first meet the person. No, that's amazing. I'd definitely love to have her on and we'll definitely sort of talk about that as well. Now, if our audience would like to find out a little bit more about you, is there a place that I can send them to?
Yes. So there are a number of different places. I do think the easiest place to find us is my lab website. That's haaslab.cesb.northwestern.edu. And you can probably also put this in the show notes. I'm also on Twitter/X. And I'm also always happy to hear from people. And we often have people who write to us and have questions about our research. And these conversations are actually really meaningful to us, because what we are really hoping to ultimately do is for this research to not just stay in the ivory tower, but to share it with people. And maybe there are people who are like, I really have a very different take on what you're talking about. And I love hearing from those people as well. Like, those conversations are really important, and we learn a lot from them.
Yeah, no, that's perfect. Again, thank you so much, Claudia, for joining me on. And I hope the audience and everyone enjoyed the episode as much as I did and learned as much as I did when it comes to relationships and the fact that it does get easier with time. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you all in the next episode. You've been listening to All Together, the Family Science Insights podcast, produced by the Family Science Labs, a division of LMSL, the Life Management Science Labs. More episodes are available from 10 life management perspectives and can be found by searching LMSL on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and other podcasting apps available on your devices. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider rating our show, sharing it, and subscribing to our channel, as it helps other people find it so that we can grow and bring you more quality resources. More of our work can be found on our website at fa.lmsl.net, where you can join our movement. I'm Dina Sargeant. Thanks for tuning in.